My dad was framed and sentenced to 25 years. For 2 years, his wife's boyfriend lived in our house while I secretly tracked the murder weapon in his car. He blocked every letter from prison, but he never checked my phone was recording. At 9:04 a.m., I stood in the kitchen and played the recording in front of the police. The moment he realized a 16-year-old exposed him, my parents divorced when I was 13. It wasn't dramatic, no screaming, no lawyers fighting over custody, just two people who'd grown in different directions finally admitting it. I stayed with my mom, Renee, during the week and saw my dad on weekends and breaks. Dad was the kind of person who kept records of everything. He fixed things with his hands. He taught me, when I was maybe 10 years old, that the most important habit you could have was writing things down. If it matters, he said, it deserves to be documented. I didn't understand that then. I would later. Brandon Cole came into my mom's life about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. He was attentive and polished and knew exactly what to say. My mom thought he was wonderful. I thought he was a little too smooth. But I was 13 and grieving a family that had quietly come apart, so I told myself I was just being unfair. What I didn't know then, what I only learned much later, was that my dad had started noticing things around the same time. Brandon's stories never quite lined up under questions. His past was vague in a specific way. The way something is vague when it's been carefully managed. About 6 months before Victor Marsh's death, my dad hired Victor to build a background profile on Brandon Cole. That was my father's version of writing things down. 2 weeks after my dad paid Victor's final invoice, Victor turned up dead. And my dad's hunting knife was at the scene. The trial lasted 11 days. The prosecution's case looked clean from the outside. Security camera footage showing my dad's car near the bar, where Victor was last seen, his registered knife recovered near the body, and a 3-hour window in his alibi his attorney couldn't close. I was 14 at the sentencing. I remember sitting in that courtroom and watching Brandon in the front row, his arm around my mother's shoulder, nodding slowly when the verdict came in, like he was watching something overdue finally arrive. 25 to life. My mom said we had to move forward. Brandon moved into our house before the appeal window even closed. 2 years went by. I did what Brandon expected me to do. I looked like I'd given up. Then, the autumn I turned 16, I went up to the attic to pull down holiday boxes and found a waterproof bag tucked behind a section of insulation in the back corner. My father's handwriting on the cover. Inside was a journal. I sat on the attic floor for 40 minutes and read every page. Dad had been keeping entries for months before the murder, careful, detailed, observational. He documented his growing suspicion of Brandon. The way certain facts about Brandon's past didn't hold up. The way Brandon had started making himself indispensable to Renee very quickly. The entries got more specific as the months went on. Victor Marsh's name appeared around entry 6, then the PI's preliminary findings. Then, a reference to photographs that were coming. The last entry was dated March 14th, 2 days before Victor Marsh's body was found. It read, Brandon's real name may be Kyle Brennan. VM says there's a sealed record in at least one other state. Photos are coming. If something happens to me, find the bar with the red awning. Ask for the backup. Ask for Edward. Then nothing. The sentence just stopped. Like he'd been interrupted and never came back. The last thing my father wrote before his life was taken was a message meant for me. I took the journal downstairs, hid it under a loose panel beneath my bed, and made a decision. I called the prison the next morning. Collect call $4.78 a minute. I'd saved $40 from babysitting jobs over 3 weeks and budgeted it to the minute. My dad went silent when he heard my voice. I asked him why he'd stopped writing. He told me that my mom had informed him I didn't want contact, that his letters had come back unopened. I hadn't written any letters. I hadn't received a single one. Renee had been intercepting both sides. Every letter he sent, returned. Every letter I never knew to write, blocked before it started. 2 years of silence, manufactured. Before the timer on the collect call cut us off, he said one thing clearly. His voice was steady, the way it gets when he's being deliberate. Ash, find the bar. Red awning. Backup drive. Edward. The call cut out. I needed 3 more weeks of babysitting money before I could call again. Over the next 6 weeks, I made 5 more calls, timing each one to cost under $20. I used a public payphone twice when I was worried about the prepaid phone being found. I sat on a bench outside a CVS at 9 p.m. and fed quarters into a machine that smelled like mildew. Because $4.78 a minute was worth every cent to stay connected to the truth. Piece by piece, my dad reconstructed what Victor had found. Brandon Cole's real name was Kyle Brennan. He had a sealed assault conviction in another state, expunged but traceable. Victor had documented a connection between Kyle Brennan and a company whose in-house investigator before Victor went independent had flagged Brennan for threatening behavior toward a coworker who'd tried to report him. That was where their paths first crossed. Victor had been thorough. He'd been building towards something comprehensive, something that would have been difficult to dismiss. And Brandon or Kyle, or whatever name he was wearing that week, had known exactly how close Victor was getting. Victor kept physical backups of everything. Every active case, every piece of documentation. That was his professional habit, his insurance. And he'd been killed for what those backups contained. Dad's voice on those calls was always measured, but I could hear the weight underneath. At one point he said, he knew where the cameras were, Ash. He knew which angles the police would check. He picked that bar specifically. Brandon didn't just frame me, my dad said. He did his homework. I stopped using the home internet after that call and switched to the public library computers downtown. At the library, I found a civil court filing from a neighboring state. A workplace injury claim filed by a Kyle Brennan against a firm whose in-house investigator at the time was Victor Marsh, before Victor went independent. The physical description in the filing matched Brandon exactly. More important, the filing year was the last year that Kyle Brennan appeared in any documentable record. Brandon Cole as a name and an identity didn't exist before 2017. Two timelines terminated and began in the same calendar year. I photographed the library screen with my phone and uploaded it immediately to a private cloud folder I'd set up under a library-issued email address. I'd started documenting everything automatically, without deciding to. It had become instinct, the same instinct my father had tried to teach me when I was 10. Brandon Cole had no documented history before 2017. Kyle Brennan stopped having one the same year. That same week, I noticed Brandon had installed a new router. He told my mom it was to improve the Wi-Fi speeds. He also started watching me more carefully, not obviously, but I could feel it. One Sunday, when my mom was out, he went up to the attic. I watched from the stairwell. He spent 18 minutes up there. When he came back down, he said, to no one in particular, that the insulation looked fine. He wasn't checking the insulation. He came back downstairs and didn't find what he was looking for. The journal was already under my bed. He spent 18 minutes looking for something that wasn't there anymore, and I watched him do it from 3 feet away. The bar with the red awning was called Callaway's. It had been in the same location for 11 years. Mid-tier sports bar, nothing special. I skipped last period on a Thursday and took the bus across town. The main security camera footage from the night of Victor's murder had been collected by police during the original investigation. But the owner, Brian, had installed a second, independent NVR unit about 6 months before the murder, a standalone system covering the parking lot and side entrance, put in after a break-in. No one from the investigation had ever asked about it. Brian had been spooked by the proximity to the murder and had unplugged the unit the day after Victor's body was found. He'd stored it in the back office and left it there. The footage was still on it. 60-day loop, interrupted. I told Brian I was a journalism student researching wrongful conviction cases. He was quiet for a moment, and then he walked me back to his office. Edward, the security guard who'd worked the night of Victor's death, still worked Thursday and Friday shifts. He remembered that night. Not because of the investigation that followed, because of a specific patron who'd been making him uneasy the whole evening. The man wasn't drinking. He was watching exit routes. He spent most of the night near the far end of the bar mapping out the angles of the parking lot cameras. He wasn't there for the bar, Edward said. He was watching. Brian connected the NVR unit to his office monitor. The footage was intact. My dad's car entered the lot at 8:47 p.m. It left at 9:14 p.m. Victor Marsh was still alive at the bar at 9:22 p.m. I could see him on camera, at the counter, finishing a drink. Brandon Cole entered the lot at 9:31 p.m. wearing a dark jacket with an embroidered patch on the left shoulder. I recognized that patch immediately. It was the same jacket that hung in our hallway closet every single morning. Brandon stayed until 10:49 p.m. The county coroner had placed Victor Marsh's death between 10:15 and 11 p.m. My father's car had been out of that parking lot 56 minutes before the earliest edge of that window. I photographed every frame in sequence, uploading to the cloud from the parking lot while Brian held the door open. He agreed in writing to preserve the physical drive and make himself available as a witness. Caroline, the bartender on duty that night, still worked at Callaway's. She confirmed the same sequence from memory and said she'd give a formal statement. The timestamp put my father's car out of that lot before Victor even ordered his last drink. I now had a cloud folder containing photographs of my dad's journal entries, screenshots from the NVR footage with timestamps documented in full, Brian's written preservation agreement, Edward and Caroline's contact information and statement summaries, the Kyle Brennan civil court filing, my dad's account of hiring Victor Marsh. I organized everything under a single shared access link and submitted it through the contact form for a regional innocence project. The attorney who responded within 72 hours was Sloan Decker. 9 years in wrongful conviction work, 7 exonerations from 14 reviewed cases. Her first message to me was, "How old are you?" I wrote back, "Old enough to have built all of this." Within 2 weeks, Sloan filed a formal motion for evidence review with the Court of Appeals, citing the backup footage and the journal as newly discovered material evidence. The filing triggered an automatic notification to the original DA's office. It also triggered a search warrant for Brandon Cole's registered vehicle. Sloan mentioned, almost offhandedly during one of our calls, that Victor Marsh had been known in the PI community for keeping physical backups of active case materials in his car. "Old school habit," she said. "Didn't trust digital storage." She said it like she was just making conversation. Then, she said the search warrant was for Brandon's vehicle, not Victor's. 3 days later, she called me on a Tuesday evening. They found something in his trunk. The warrant execution recovered a hunting knife hidden inside a false bottom panel in Brandon's car trunk. Victor Marsh's blood. Brandon's partial fingerprint on the handle. The actual murder weapon. Concealed in Brandon's own car for 2 years. He had planted one of my father's registered hunting knives at the scene that was the evidence that convicted Dale Hargrove. But the blade he'd actually used, he'd kept. Hiding it created less risk than disposing of it, or maybe arrogance made him feel invincible. Either way, it had been sitting in a panel in his trunk while he ate breakfast in my father's chair every morning. That Friday evening, Brandon came home changed. He spent a long time in the living room not speaking. Then he found me alone in the kitchen and sat down across from me. His voice was quiet and even. "You're creating problems for this family," he said. "Your father is not coming back. If you keep stirring things up, your mother won't forgive you for it." I didn't say anything. He let the silence stretch, then added, "I just don't want to see your mom hurt." He said it warmly. He'd pivoted perfectly. But 4 words earlier, before the warmth, he'd said something else. I made sure of that. He caught himself. Stopped. Recovered. But I'd had the voice recorder running on my prepaid phone since the day I saw him searching the attic. The reflex had started weeks ago. His quiet threat, his partial admission, every word of it already on tape. He forgot to check if I was recording. I sent the audio to Sloan that night. She was honest with me. The 4-word admission was circumstantially strong, but it wouldn't anchor a criminal charge on its own. A defense attorney would argue context and ambiguity. The knife forensics would substantially power my dad's appeal, but the appeals process was not fast. 18 to 24 months was a realistic cycle. Meanwhile, the clock was moving against us from every direction. Brandon was increasingly paranoid. The journal was still in the house. Every month we waited was another month my father couldn't get back. That night I called my dad. He told me I didn't have to do this. I told him I knew. That was the whole conversation, 2 sentences, and it was the only thing that needed to be said. The next morning I moved the journal to my neighbor's house under the pretext of returning a borrowed book. It was off-site before Brandon finished his coffee. I had one more thing to do. I just needed him to give me the opening. He gave it to me 11 days later. I came downstairs at 11 p.m. Brandon was in the kitchen on the phone, his voice low, but the house was quiet. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Yeah, I know she's been talking to someone. I need to handle it before the weekend." A pause. "The journal, if it's here, I'll find it this time. And when I do, this all goes away." 2 days before Sloan's scheduled motion hearing. He wasn't planning to wait for legal proceedings to close in on him. He was going to move first, find the journal, destroy it, and bury the last piece of physical evidence before the court ever saw it. I went back to my room, sat on the edge of my bed for 4 minutes. Then I texted Sloan. He knows about the journal. He's going to move this weekend. We need to go tomorrow. She responded in 6 minutes. I'll have someone positioned by 9 a.m. There was no version of that night where I waited. The The journal was safe at the neighbor's house. The recording was uploaded. The attorney was primed. The witnesses were documented and ready. 2 years of quiet, careful work, and now it came down to one conversation. I texted Sloan at 11 p.m. "It's happening tomorrow. Be ready." Saturday morning. My mom left for work at 9. At 9:04 a.m., I walked into the kitchen carrying my father's journal. My prepaid phone was in my sweatshirt pocket, voice recorder running, a backup app. Sloan had configured streaming live audio to a receiving line she was monitoring with 2 detectives parked on the street outside. I set the journal on the kitchen table in front of Brandon and sat down across from him. "I found this in the attic," I said. "Some of the entries don't make sense to me. I was hoping you could help. I was 16 years old." I sounded exactly like a confused teenager who'd stumbled onto something she didn't understand. I'd been performing that role for 2 years, and I was very good at it. Brandon looked at the journal, then at me, then back at the journal. His guard came down the way it always did, automatically, completely, because he had been managing my perceived incompetence for so long that it was reflex. "Your dad was paranoid, Ash," he said, sliding the journal toward himself. "He saw threats everywhere. You know that." "It mentions someone named Kyle Brennan," I said. His hand stopped on the cover. "And a man named Victor Marsh," I added. "And a bar." He wrote about a bar. Brandon set the journal down very carefully. He looked at me differently now, recalibrating, but not retreating. His fundamental mistake was that he still believed this was manageable, that I was still the child he'd been talking down for 2 years. He leaned forward instead of back, because that's what arrogance does. It presses forward even when it should stop. "Your father put Victor Marsh up to it," he said. "Marsh was going to expose things about me that weren't true. Things that would have destroyed what I'd built. Your dad knew that. He used it." He paused. I didn't have a choice. I kept my voice even. "And what came next?" He looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. "You know what came next." The front door opened 30 seconds later. Brandon stood up. The 2 detectives came through the kitchen doorway. Sloan was on the street. Brandon looked at me not with rage, not with desperation, just with the specific expression of a man who has finally understood what he miscalculated. He'd spent 2 years underestimating a 16-year-old who'd learned to document things from her father. He was arrested in the house he'd occupied for 2 years, in the kitchen that was never his, at the table where he'd been sitting in the wrong chair every single morning. 3 months later, the evidentiary hearing for my father's wrongful conviction appeal. The prosecution did not contest the motion. Brandon Cole, charged under his legal name, Kyle Brennan, with the first-degree murder of Victor Marsh, had more serious legal concerns at that point, and his criminal defense attorney had counseled non-opposition on the wrongful conviction appeal. The DA's office issued a statement acknowledging material evidence, not reviewed at the time of original trial. That was their language for 2 years of a man's life. The evidence was presented in order. My father's journal, the original, plus the cloud-backed photographs establishing Brandon's real identity and my dad's documented fear 2 days before the murder. The backup NVR footage from Calloway's bar, correcting the timeline with timestamps the original investigation had never reviewed. Edward and Caroline's sworn witness statements. The forensic analysis of the hunting knife recovered from Brandon's trunk. Victor Marsh's blood. Brandon's partial fingerprint on the handle. The authenticated audio recording from our kitchen on Saturday morning, transcribed in full and entered into the record. I watched the judge review the timestamp comparison on the NVR footage. My dad's car leaving at 9:14 p.m., Victor still alive at 9:22 p.m., Brandon arriving at 9:31 p.m. It took her about 45 seconds. She made one note in the margin and set the page down. The DA stood and did not oppose exoneration. Renee was in the back row. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at my dad. She stared at the middle distance of the room's back wall for the entire hearing, and when I glanced back once, she looked like someone who had been reading a sentence wrong for years and had finally, against her will, understood what it said. Sloan's closing contained one line that the whole room felt. This is a man's handwriting, 2 days before his life was taken from him, naming the person who would take it. The gavel came down. My father stood up for the first time in 2 years as a free man. He walked out of the correctional facility on a Tuesday morning. I was there. Renee was not. We stood in the parking lot for a while without talking. My dad has always known when not to rush a moment. Then he looked at me and said, "How did you pay for the calls?" $4.78 a minute. Babysitting jobs, 3 weeks of saving per call, 40 minutes at a time over 2 years. He laughed. A real laugh, the first I'd heard from him in 2 years, and it sounded exactly like I remembered. Kyle Brennan tried under his legal name, convicted of first-degree murder in the first degree, was sentenced 6 months later. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Life without parole. He said at sentencing that he'd been forced into a corner, that Victor Marsh had left him no choice. He was entitled right up to the end. Consistent with himself. Exactly the man he'd always been. My mom called me 3 months after my dad's release. I didn't answer. A week later she sent a text. I didn't know. I wrote back one line. You chose not to. I didn't block her number. I didn't call back either. My dad's journal sits on my desk now. Not hidden. Right next to my own, the one I've been keeping since I was 16. Dale taught me that if something matters, it deserves to be documented. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things. The calls are free now. We talk every Sunday. QC block. Estimated word count, approximately 4,010 words. Script body, verified via WCW. Central injustice clear, in opening 15-20%. Yes. Within the first 250 words, the audience knows Dale Hargrove is in prison for a murder he didn't commit. The real killer is living in the family home, and Ashley has proof. The injustice is named with full specificity before any flashback begins. Primary lever, authority dramatized. Yes. Sloan Decker's formal motion for evidence review, the court-issued search warrant for Brandon's vehicle, forensic lab analysis of the knife, and the judge's exoneration order are all woven in as procedural moments that carry weight without becoming a law lecture. The audience understands why Ashley has legitimate leverage at each stage. Public climax clear. Yes. 2-part, the kitchen confession, domestic, controlled trap, and the courtroom exoneration, formal, witnessed. Both land as distinct emotional payoffs. The first is catharsis of exposure. The second is catharsis of vindication. Point of no return sufficient. Yes. Beat 7.2 Ashley overhearing Brandon name the journal and announce his intention to act before the weekend is the clearest possible trigger. She has no choice but to move first. The scene is written as a cold, irrevocable moment of strategic clarity, not emotional breakdown. Receipts planted and paid off. Yes. Journal. Planted beat 1.1, discovered beat 3.1, secured beat 7.1, weaponized beat 8.1, at rest beat 9.1. NVR footage and witness statements, planted beat 3.1 via the backup, paid off fully beat 5.1, 5.2. Brandon, Kyle identity trail, planted beat 4.2, paid off at courtroom. Knife, foreshadowed via Victor's backup habit, paid off beat 6.1. Audio recording, planted beat 4.3 via recording habit, partial payoff, beat 6.2, full payoff beat 8.1. Iconic symbol, motif with payoff. Yes. The journal appears 6 times with escalating emotional meaning. The $4.78 minute collect call cost opens and closes the story, transforming from a constraint into a measure of what the contact was worth. Minimum 3 hard mini-cliffs at macro transitions, yes. End of background section. Brandon was in our house before the appeal window closed. End of inciting incident. The last thing my father wrote before his life was taken was a message meant for me. End of plan and risks. I texted Sloan at 11 p.m. It's happening tomorrow. Be ready. Additional hard cliffs throughout maintain microtension. Villain has is greater than or equal to 2 clear strikes before climax. Yes. Strike 1 router installation and attic search, active surveillance, establishes Brandon as directly dangerous to Ashley's investigation. Strike 2 kitchen confrontation with quiet threat and partial admission I made sure of that raises immediate personal danger to highest point before plan section. 1-2 iconic closing lines. Yes. He forgot to check if I was recording. You chose not to. Both are short, quotable, and earn their weight from what precedes them. No convenient twists or illogical payoffs. Confirmed. Every receipt has a prior plant. The NVR footage is established as existing due to a prior break-in, not convenience. The knife is in Brandon's trunk because arrogance made disposal feel riskier than hiding a plausible character logic. The confession happens because Ashley engineered the conditions over 2 years, not because Brandon arbitrarily breaks. No deus ex machina. Every piece of leverage Ashley carries into the climax was documented, sourced, and moved into position by her own sustained work. Antagonist voice consistent and believable. Yes. Brandon is dismissive, self-justifying, image-conscious, and quietly threatening throughout. Never cartoonish. His kitchen speech, "I didn't have a choice," is the most revealing moment, and it is earned by the prior characterization. Audio-only compliance. Yes. No scene requires visual information to land. Every twist is communicated through narration and dialogue. Boykan described in brief concrete details: cast iron skillet, red awning bar, parking lot NVR unit, false bottom trunk panel. No SFX dependency, tone consistency. Yes. Ashley narrates throughout as calm, methodical, and firm, never performs grief for the audience, never delivers speeches. Brandon's dialogue is clipped, self-serving, and menacing in its quietness. Sloan is practical and direct. The tone holds from the first sentence to the last,